Greetings all, and welcome to another episode of Caricature Development. Only 3 years after the last episode. Today's topic is how video games have interpreted the Banshee, the wailing ghosts of Irish folklore that might well be the country's most widely known legends. While it might not be March anymore, the month where I usually talk about video games that incorporate Irish myths, stories, and paganism, this episode was an idea I had on the back burner from last March. But since it has ties to the previous episode of Character Development proper, I figured I had an even better opportunity this year than I did in 2019. For those who already watched that episode on Castlevania's Fomorians, we'll be delving into the Book of Invasions again. But for those who haven't seen that video, don't worry. I'll explain it all and more in the next few minutes. I'm the Kitsune Hawk, and today we'll be taking another look into the world of Irish folklore to talk about the wailing harbingers of sorrow and loss, the Banshee, and how they've been implemented in a number of video games across multiple genres and generations. I hope you're ready to take notes, because this is Caricature Development. Although I'm confident in saying that the Banshee is one of the most well-known creatures of Irish legend, their origins are nowhere near as well-known, and their original role has been misunderstood and blurred over time. To start, let's go over the word Banshee itself, which is an anglicized Irish phrase meaning woman of the mounds. The mounds being referred to here are raths, hill forts, and, most interestingly, barrows. Ancient burial mounds scattered across Ireland, as well as the neighboring island of Britannia. Even though we think of Ireland today as being a distinctively Celtic nation, the island had long been populated by groups of pre-Celtic, European peoples, and these were the societies that built the barrows. The oldest known barrows in Ireland have been dated as far back as the later Neolithic period, which ended around 2500 BCE. Included in this category is the Tomb of Newgrange in County Meath, dated to about 3200 BCE, making it older than both Stonehenge and the pyramids at Giza. However, the more noticeable majority of barrows in Ireland have been traced to the Bronze Age, between 2000 BCE and 500 BCE, and they were built in a variety of shapes and styles. Given the amount of effort it took to construct a burial mound and deliver the religious rites for burying the dead, archaeologists posit that the barrows were reserved for local figures or families of importance, and some have been found to contain artifacts from multiple dates, indicating that they were reused for multiple generations and remained important for more than just one burial. The first Celts in Ireland, meanwhile, were traditionally dated to have arrived from the European mainland somewhere around the year 500 BCE, though years as early as 800 BCE and as late as 400 BCE have also been suggested. With their knowledge of ironworking, the Celts wielded a powerful advantage over the island's traditional bronze-wielding population, ultimately eclipsing them within a few centuries' time. Unlike the Europeans before them, the Celts didn't construct barrows, nor did they leave behind any known documentation of the barrows or why they were important. The Irish language wouldn't have a system of writing until the 4th century CE, more or less a millennium after the initial arrival of the Celts, and centuries following the dissolution of the pre-Celtic population. Skip ahead a few more centuries into the medieval period, and there was finally an attempt to understand the origin and purpose of the barrows, within the pages of an 11th century chronicle known as the Lawer Gwaala na HÉireann, or the Book of Invasions, As Béarla. The Book of Invasions was an attempt to piece together a unified, understandable narrative chronicling the early history of Ireland, though it also involved a very complex mishmashing of Irish paganism with Catholic Christianity, since literacy was largely restricted to those with religious jobs, such as monks, friars, and priests. However flawed this seems to us now, it was a tremendous undertaking and a highly influential text for its time, especially because of its central idea of the Six Invasions, a model positing that Ireland's culture and society were progressively built by the arrival and efforts of 6 different populations, starting with the followers of Cessair, who was a granddaughter of the biblical Noah, and ending with the Milesians, who were understood to be the early Celts. As much as I would love to talk about the entire saga, as far as we're concerned today, we only need to talk about the last 2 invasions, the Tuatha De Danann and the aforementioned Milesians. The story of the Tuatha De Danann comprises the longest and most detailed chapter in the Book of Invasions. Described as descendants of the Nemedians, who were the people of the 3rd invasion, they fled from Ireland to 4 cities in a mysterious location referred to as the North of the World, where they became known as the Tuatha De Danann, or the Tribe of Danu. After spending nearly 270 years in the north of the world, they returned to Ireland, equipped with their 4 divine treasures, as well as advanced technology, armor, and weapons, all of which allowed them to conquer the island's 2 existing populations, the Fir-Bolg of the 4th invasion, and the monstrous Fomorians who came from beneath the ocean. The ascribed divinity of the Tuatha De Danann, however, only went so far, and after an impressive 150 years of rule, they were defeated when relations with the people of the last invasion, the Milesians, soured into assassination, and then warfare. In the treaty that followed, the victorious Milesians received ownership of all Irish land, while the Tuatha De Danann were consigned to live underground, within the other world parallel to this realm of existence. The Milesians would go on to invent the Goidelic Celtic language, ancestor of today's Irish language, and build their capital at the Hill of Tara, while the exiled Tuatha De Danann would take on a new identity. No longer the sacred tribe of Danu, they became known as the Iashi, or People of the Hills. Whether it was because of their new underground habitat, their partial Fomorian blood, or some other environmental factor, they progressively lost their human bodies and transformed into a number of fairies and spirits, including recognizable names like the Selkie, Dullahan, Changeling, and of course, the Banshee. Although they normally reside in the other world, the Iashi are known to enter the world of humans again, using the barrows and other mounds as a gateway, and the legends of the Banshee are a perfect example for illustrating this behavior. Depending on the story, a Banshee can take on a number of different physical appearances, including that of a shrouded woman with undiscernible features, as a woman with ghostly pale skin and eyes red from constant tears, as an old, ominous, hag-like woman, or they can even borrow the appearance of a virgin woman who died young. However they look, the appearance of a Banshee is accompanied by the sounds of crying, wailing, screaming, or lamentation, and this leads me to the most widespread misconception about the Banshee. It does not cause death with its wailing, but rather, the sounds of a Banshee either herald a death soon to come, or mourn a death which has already happened. They're harbingers of death, but not necessarily killers themselves. A Banshee's cry means that someone close to the listener, most often a family member, is either dead or going to die. But it's also not uncommon for the cry to herald the listener's death, if they're on the cusp of making a decision or being in a situation that will ultimately cost them their life. The subject of the Banshee's wail tends to be unknown, though in some variations, a Banshee will appear while washing the clothes or entrails of the person their sounds are referring to. Also not entirely consistent is exactly who the Banshees will appear to. Tradition holds that Banshees will only associate with people who are direct descendants of the Gaelic Celts, being understood as the progeny of the Milesians who banished them underground so long ago. But of course, exceptions aren't unheard of. For the sake of an example, there are accounts of Banshees appearing around members and descendants of the Fitzgerald dynasty and similar families of Eastern Ireland, who, despite being a mix of English, Welsh, and Norman backgrounds, assimilated themselves into Irish culture so well that they were commonly referred to as being more Irish than the Irish themselves. Acts of cultural interaction and exchange such as these might have marked some of the earliest popularization of the Banshee mythos outside of Ireland, naturally expanding from there as time progressed, whether it was through waves of Irish immigration or the expansion of the British Empire. Acts that brought stories and literature like these to new audiences around the world. Truly a complicated evolution from a few people trying to understand some weird-looking hills. But that's merely one potential theory out of many, and the one I find most interesting and plausible. So now that we've covered that complicated web of probable origins, we can address how the medium of video games has added to the ongoing retelling of the Banshee legend. Right off the bat, I want to start with my favorite example, just because it gives me an outlet to finally mention a game I've garnered a particularly strong fondness for since last October. In the obscure, and also underappreciated, Animal Crossing-inspired DS title Magician's Quest Mysterious Times, there are a number of villagers and other NPCs based on creatures from folklore and mythology in addition to animals. One of these villagers, Grace, is meant to be a banshee, certainly looking the part with her bluish-gray skin, tired eyes, and disheveled hair. This series went on to have 3 more entries, though all of them remain Japan exclusive. I certainly hope that Grace got to reappear in at least one of them. Why not befriend a banshee, after all? Continuing on, Warcraft 3 includes banshees as playable units for the Undead faction, and the game's lore mentions that they were originally night elves who were murdered and became vengeful spirits gifted with agony-inducing voices. Very much like the fall of the Tuatha and their gradual conversion into the Iashi. Gameplay-wise, these banshees attack from a distance by using their voice to create sonic bursts, while their abilities reduce enemy accuracy and magic damage to ally units. After completing master training, they also gain the ability to possess and control enemy units. Behavior that's more like a typical ghost than a banshee specifically. Also included in this category is Sylvanas Windrunner, a high elf who became a banshee in death and bore the title of the Banshee Queen for the duration of this particular character arc. Perhaps it's my unfamiliarity with Warcraft speaking, but I don't think I can see much else to discuss with Sylvanas specifically, at least pertaining to the whole banshee thing. And yes, the banshees also appear in World of Warcraft, which, alongside the Manual of Monsters, suggests that females from other races can potentially become banshees, or, on even rarer occasions, males can potentially become banshees too. Deviating a tad from the mythos in that regard, but all of it's still a well-done portrayal. Speaking of Blizzard Entertainment, another nod to the banshee can be found in Overwatch, as a special skin for the support hero Moira, first appearing in the Halloween Terror 2018 event. This one's especially fitting, given that Moira herself is Irish, and her gameplay is focused on playing with the lives and deaths of her teammates and enemies, respectively. So in a way, it's almost like coming around full circle. We're just missing the trademark Banshee shriek. Maybe a little "surrender to my whale" for her ultimate line? Don't make it a missed opportunity now. Final Fantasy has applied the name Banshee to a handful of undead enemies in a number of entries, including Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy Tactics A2, and Crystal Defenders, but it's the Banshees from Final Fantasy XII that are probably the closest to the mythos, because their bestiary entries mention their habit of weeping and moaning for the dead, and, if engaged in battle, one of their techniques happens to be a sonic attack named Wail. Shin Megami Tensei, a series I really should do standalone videos on now that I think about it, includes banshees as featured demons in several of its entries. Across these appearances, they're usually defined as either a fairy or a ghost, appear as a woman in mourning, and use a number of sound-based attacks, including Panic Voice and Sonic Wave in the main entries, and Cold Voice in the Devil Children games. Miitopia includes banshees in its lineup of enemies as well, and these are worth a mention primarily because they're a surprisingly rare example of a fictional banshee that goes for the crying aspect of their character only, and not the far more well-known screaming aspect. Or yelling, if you want to word it less threateningly. RuneScape also includes Banshees as enemies, found on the ground floor of Slayer Tower, and in stronger variations within the depths of the Polnivnich Slayer dungeon. I hope I said that correctly. These Banshee Screams are such a noteworthy threat that you'll have to find and equip earmuffs if you want to safely fight against them. RuneScape also has a special piece of equipment called a Mask of Mourning, which not only allows the player to teleport where Banshees are located and provides immunity to their screams, but it will also become a Helm of Keening after killing 200 Banshees while having it equipped. The payoff for this? An emote that lets you briefly transform into a Banshee yourself. You are what you slay, I suppose. The Screech Pokemon, Misdreavus, and its eventual evolution Mismagius, have possible Banshee influence, though it's also mixed with other sources of inspiration. Their Pokédex entries mention their habit of making spooky noises, especially weeping and shrieking, to frighten others. And one of the moves they can learn naturally is Perish Song, which heralds the eventual death, or fainting, of those who hear it. Their ghost typing is a bit of extra icing on the cake, though I'd say Misdreavus is the closer of the two to an actual Banshee, while Mismagius is much more like a witch instead. Fable 1 and 2 have arguably two different takes on the Banshee, one in each game. In the case of Fable 1, there are enemies called Screamers, which are female ghosts with long, torn robes and life-sapping screams. In-game lore also defines the Screamers as horrific entities caught in the netherworlds, akin to the fate of the Banshee and really the Iashi as a whole. And then in Fable 2, enemies actually called Banshees appear, and these go for the shrouded figure interpretation. Their faces obscured in darkness, but their arms a lifeless alabaster. However, rather than heralding the future or the present, these Banshees choose to haunt the player with their past instead, making a number of demoralizing comments based on your actions up to that point. They also differ from the previous examples, and indeed the mythos, by appearing alongside unnatural offspring, which seem to be undead children of some kind. Speaking of summoning things as backup, that's something the Banshees in Fable 2 have in common with the Banshees in The Witcher 3, the Blood and Wine expansion, to be specific. These Banshees can summon skeletons to come to their aid, and further use their signature screams to temporarily stun Geralt. However, I should also note, and commend, an additional detail here, and that's that The Witcher 3 mentions that its Banshees aren't expressly malicious, though the sight of one is often an omen of grim tidings. Confounding correlation with causation, just like the old Irish myths they draw from. Mass Effect 3 doesn't include literal Banshees, but an interesting use of the term, given its sci-fi setting. These Banshees are the result of Asari being corrupted and exploited by the Reapers. The Asari themselves are an all-female race, matching the mythological Banshee, and some of them have an unintentionally destructive trait that causes them to bring death with whomever they mate with. These Asari are called Arda Yakshi, and these are the ones that the Reapers use to create Banshees, taking their innate ability to bring about death and turning it into something far more monstrous. This naming convention is even more fitting because Mass Effect's Banshees have a very Phantom-like way of moving by repeatedly teleporting, and, as expected, they make their presence apparent by screaming. I might be cheating by including Halo here, since this involves talking about vehicles instead of sentient characters like everything else here, but it's still another interesting example, minutiae aside. So in Halo lore, the various vehicles of the Covenant are given spectral-themed nicknames by humans. Included in this assortment is the Type 26 ground support aircraft and its variants, otherwise known as Banshees. The name was coined for two reasons. The Type 26's engines and the distinctive screeching sound they make as they zoom by, as well as their initial circling tactics and need to stay in constant motion, more or less resembling a banshee shrieking through the air. And while we're still on the topic of science fiction themed video games, I should also mention that Warframe includes a frame named Banshee. Try saying that multiple times. Fitting for its name, and similar to previously mentioned examples, Banshee specializes in using sound as a weapon. That's about as far as it goes unless you want to nitpick, but I still appreciate the reference regardless. Castlevania Order of Ecclesia features enemies called Banshees, located in the monastery area, and there's even a quest called The Killing Screen, in which Shinoa has to record one of their screams using a phonograph. Because I didn't already meet my quota of lesser-known titles with Magician's Quest earlier, let us turn our attention to the masterworks that is Dragon's Dogma: Dark Arisen. Here, Banshees are a particularly strong variety of undead foe that can be found on Bitter Black Isle. And their main method of attack is letting out a shriek that inflicts varying damage and either staggers or knocks you down, depending on how close you are to the Banshee. Other than that, though, there's not much else to specifically highlight. And finally, let us conclude with one of the most well-known examples of a Banshee-inspired video game character, that being Sindel from the Mortal Kombat series. Ever since her debut in Mortal Kombat 3, she's incorporated her voice into her fighting style. But I should also point out that she's an Edenian, not a Banshee outright. Still, it is neat to see how much mileage the franchise has gotten out of this and Sindel's other abilities, ranging from simple screams that knock her foe off guard to supersonic shrieks that absolutely eviscerate her opponents. Expectedly, several of these have garnered Banshee-themed nicknames, so I guess you could say that she's an honorary Banshee, alongside some of these other examples. And with that concludes this episode of Caricature Development. Thanks for sticking around to the conclusion this time around, as today's episode was not only the first in quite a long while, but also because I was just a wee bit nervous about the number of games I was unfamiliar with prior to scripting. Of course, there are certainly more examples out there, since making this video meant handpicking the ones I felt would make for varied and interesting discussion. From these collective examples, we've seen video games that interpret the Banshee as wrathful, vengeful spirits, giving them the ability to both herald and cause death, video games that use the Banshee's famous wailing and crying as a foundation for expanded sound-centered design, and also video games that make special mention of their properly grey nature as harbinger fairy folk. That aforementioned greyness, I would say, is a core reason why the Banshee is such a fascinating creature to me. One with a good amount of potential for interpretation by writers and game designers alike. Their association with death and loss, compounded with their frightening wails, certainly makes them figures to be feared. But does that guarantee they're automatically ill-intentioned? Or are they misunderstood messengers separate from the message they bear? We're bound to see more video games including Banshees in some way, shape, or form, each fitting somewhere into the spectrum in the process. And I'm eager to see how these centuries-old stories continue to evolve in the interactive medium. Thanks again for watching, stay healthy, and take care, everyone.